Good morning, everyone. I'm Vrije, one of the co-organizers of the seminar, and it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker who is with us online. I'm hoping we can actually get his head on the screen as well, in addition to his slides. And is that something that we should do, or Darrell, can you do that yourself? Oh, there you are.
Yeah. Oh, you mean that we see him as well?
Yeah.
Yeah. And move the. Sure.
Okay, so let me say a few words about Darrell. So Darrell Rowbottom is professor of philosophy at Vrije Universiteit in Hong Kong. His work is in philosophy of science, epistemology, philosophy of probability, philosophy of physics. He actually has a wonderful textbook on the philosophy of probability, which if you don't know it, you should check out. It's aptly titled Probability, I think. He's also the right. He's also the editor of one of the premier journals in philosophy of science, Studies in History and Philosophy of Science, Part A. And I think he's known to defend slightly unpopular or unconventional positions in philosophy of science. So, for instance, he has a recent book defending scientific instrumentalism, which is the view that scientific theories are not in the business of making truth claims, but are mere instruments that can be more or less useful and effective in making predictions. So not a position that a lot of people hold in philosophy of science these days, I think. And my impression is that his talk today is also in that same category of slightly unpopular or surprising opinions. So he's going to talk to us about, well, he's going to explore and defend the position that there are no objectively correct answers to the question of what the aim or aims of science is or are. And as a result, there's also no objectively correct view on what scientific progress is. So the title of this talk is scientific progress just what you'd like? So Darrell, the screen is yours.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me okay. Thanks for the introduction. It's amusing you say defending or advocating unpopular views, because this isn't really sort of my intent. So it's just the way things turn out sometimes. So the talk kind of starts with a confession about a misspent academic youth, because I spent a long time publishing on scientific progress, and I think I'm going to ask you to forgive me for my sins, given what I'm about to say. Because as time's gone on, I've become increasingly concerned about various aspects of the classic debate. And the classic debate just involves advocating general theories of what constitutes scientific progress. You know, scientific progress is when knowledge increases, or scientific progress is when problem-solving power increases. People actually argue about this, which view is right. All those that accept that there are multiple dimensions of progress, they think one is more central than others. And they argue about this. I've contributed to these, to these arguments, which I now perhaps regret somewhat. So it's become apparent to me, a few things have become apparent to me. One is that the rules of the argumentative game are only implicit. Right? It isn't evident how the methods we use to advance our arguments would actually be well suited to the task. You know, we use thought experiments, we use historical illustrations, we use case studies. It is just clear what would be the kind, what an argument would look like that would lead to a kind of principal resolution of the dispute. It just doesn't seem clear. Sadly, actually, it doesn't even seem to me clear what exactly the task is. I'm going to say more about that. I think that there can be semblances of agreement and disagreement here that mask pretty significant underlying differences. And I'm sorry to say, it isn't even clear to me there's a worthwhile philosophical task in the vicinity that's left by the vagueness that I see. And the source of the problem, I think, is that various foundational questions about progress haven't been addressed properly or seriously considered. And in fact, in the introductory remarks, René mentioned that, you know, it's epistemology and philosophy of science, and we're bringing in other disciplines. I'm sorry to tell you, I think these problems are actually metanormative. So I think we need even more fundamental philosophy. We need to think about some of these issues if the problems can be solved. Okay, so I tried to repent in my forthcoming book. I was asked to write this book for the Elements Cambridge University Press series on philosophy of science, and this talk is really a précis of the book. And what I didn't want to do, I decided, was just, you know, put forward another, here's what scientific progress is, and yet another account, because I was starting to get worried. So I went down the rabbit hole, looking back in time, looking back to see if I could find answers to some of the puzzles that were developing for me. I couldn't find them in the old literature. Okay, so I'm going through the book is a kind of précis. There are going to be holes, there are going to be gaps. I'll try to focus on the key issues and arguments. It's going to be quite intense. I'm going to be quite fast, but hopefully that'll make it exciting, a roller coaster ride, I don't know, rather than dull and repetitive. And I'll strive only to consider the best objections and arguments if I can. So why did I start in this way? You might think it was an odd way to start. It's because it is an iconoclastic talk. And I didn't want you to think, especially now, actually, the way Jerome introduced me, I'm not saying something radical just to make ripples, okay? It's not the point. I've kind of stumbled upon what I think is, or as I thought about it more and more and more, started to recognizing there's a real awful problem here, trying to pick up some of the pieces. And I'm going to be highly critical of some of the work of others. And of course, I wanted to point out that I take some of my old work on this to be misguided. I don't cite the old work of mine I don't like. So it genuinely begins as a story of increasing mystification and concern over an extended period. I read back through the history of philosophy, and it culminated in a kind of disappointment and then a determination to try to do something about it. I'm not sure how successful I am, but worth a try. So here's the outline of the talk. I'm going to start off by trying to explain why I think metanormative issues matter. Then I'm going to focus on what I consider to be the most pressing problem of that character, which is the source of the standards that we use to judge progress, right? Called these second order goodness makers. Then I'm going to talk about this appeal to the aims of science as a potential solution and why I don't think it works very well. And then I actually thought quite carefully. I mean, it might not always come across in this talk, but I thought quite carefully about how to solve the problems. And I tried to come up with my own account of the aim of science. I only got part way, so I got a kind of necessary condition, which is a hypothetical rationality condition. And then I use this to kind of inform and develop my current position, which is a kind of subjectivist and quasi-error theoretic view. It has a lot of similarities to, well, it's inspired by at least Mackey's view on ethics, meta-ethics. And I've got a few closing remarks. Okay, so this is Darrell Rowbottom writing in 1984. In many discussions of the development of science, the notion of progress is either left unanalyzed or characterized only in vague terms. Pretty accurately reflected the way things were in 1984. And I'm sorry to say that I don't think things have got much better. Maybe they haven't got really any better at all. Maybe I've tried to make them a little bit better. There was an exchange between Rose and Van Fraasen that maybe shed a bit of light on things. So what can we say about progress? Well, I discuss it quite a bit in the book, but the very basic notion. Well, look, we're on a safe ground, at least in saying that it's a normative notion and it requires change. Okay, so progress judgments involve comparisons between different states or appropriate surrogates. That's the most basic idea, kind of binary comparison. Actually, a lot of philosophers of science have written about sequences instead. What does a progressive sequence look like or not look like? And I think a lot of mistakes have been made there, but I won't say anything about it here. So Darrell puts it so: to say that a step from stage A to stage B constitutes progress means that B is an improvement over A in some respect, i.e. B is better than A relative to some standards or criteria. Now, this is also something that was raised by Rennie, right? There can be different dimensions of progress. So I have to be clear about what we're talking about. And actually, we haven't really been clear enough in philosophy of science, I'm sorry to say. It's something, it isn't even clear, it's quite epistemic. So I've already intimated that cognitive progress is the focus of contemporary literature in the philosophy of science. And Loudon popularized this term, which he defined as, quote, nothing more nor less than progress with respect to the intellectual aspirations of science. Notice the word aspirations is already creeping in. Aspirations look a lot like aims. They're quite similar. I think they're quite the same thing. So this leaves open the question, what's the scope of the cognitive? And that just isn't all that clear. So is the form of normativity at issue, is it epistemic? Is it pragmatic? Is it an admixture of each? Is it something else altogether? I discuss this in the book. Can't see anything more about it now, sadly. Another aspect of this is what kinds of things change when progress occurs, right? So even if you answered the previous question, what are the bearers of goodness? How often philosophers of science discuss content, like theories? But is that right? I mean, actually, sometimes they discuss just beliefs about theories rather than the theories themselves. Some of you might know Popper's work, where he discusses the idea that you can just actually have a look, you can have progress, something like it, get objective knowledge by having information in books, even if it isn't in people's heads. How about methods? Can you change your methods be progressive? How about your values? Can that be progressive? Actually, if you read some of Loudon's work on this, his reticulated model of science, those of you who know it, time to go through it, there it seems like changing your values could create rationality or restore rationality in science. That seems like progress from a certain point of view, since like cognitive progress, no. So I can't say much more about these. I tackle them in chapter 2, other than that I actually argue that cognitive has a really pretty broad scope, right? So I'm pretty pluralistic about what can count as cognitive progress. In principle, if the other problems can be solved. Here are some other issues I cover, but can't say more about here. All metanormative issues. Are cognitive scientific standard elements of an authoritative normative system? Is there so-called normative force in this domain? Often people say in ethics there is normative force, right? There's something about saying, you know, you shouldn't terminate a pregnancy. Let's say you shouldn't terminate a pregnancy if you haven't been raped or you're willingly engaged in, you know, consensual activity and you have the potential to create life within, you know, after in the 3rd trimester, like something extreme. That seems to have some kind of force to it that the law don't write on banknotes doesn't, right? There seems to be some kind of force there. So is there normative force in the context of these kind of cognitive normative science? And whatever the standards are, if you come up with them, can they be ordered in terms of significance? Because if you've got multiple standards, you're going to have an algorithm of choice kind of issue problem, which Kuhn talks about. So Kuhn discusses theoretical virtues, and then you get these problems where one theory is a bit simpler than another, but it's not quite so accurate. And then you get these questions of, is there a kind of authoritative single ordering? And Kuhn argues no, and I think that it's quite plausible there wouldn't be such an ordering, even if we got the standards. And you can also ask, do progress claims even have truth conditions? I will come back to this, and when if so. Okay, so there are loads of metanormative issues here that I don't think clusters of science have really said very much about at all. I mean, you can find little comments here and there, throwaways, but no one's really tried to drill down into this and get a really systematic treatment of any of them, despite the fact we've been discussing aims of science and things like that for a very long time. You know, even back to Duhem's, you know, the English translation is actually the aim and structure of physical theory, but it's still an object. It's object in French, object in the sense of objective in English. Objectif. So it is the same. So this is the most significant problem, though. Neglected question is, whence do the standards originate? Where do they come from? Right? There are these standards, and they're important for judging when progress has occurred. Where do they come from? You can think of this as a request for the 2nd order scientific cognitive goodness makers, right? The 1st order ones are going to be properties of the goodness bearers. So imagine the goodness bearers are theories. Then the 1st order goodness makers could potentially be things like truth or approximate truth or empirical adequacy, properties possessed by those bearers. But the 2nd order goodness makers are the things that make those, the properties that those things have, they're the standards by which you're then going to judge, right, whether the progress is really being made. So they're the kind of the next level down. And what's been discussed endlessly is what the 1st order ones are, not what the 2nd order ones are. Okay, so that's the source of standards problem. Now, it largely appears to be presumed in contemporary discussions of scientific progress that the standards are objective. It's a little bit difficult to look at the literature. I mean, no one really quite comes out and says this really brutally, but it seems like it's an assumption there. At least people go on in these discussions like they're really arguing about something of substance, a real difference in the world. And people seem to think there's a fact of matter about what they are, irrespective of the values, the preferences of the philosophers or scientists discussing them. Now, consider this remarkable passage from Kuyper as a case in point. I think this is actually, I have to be honest, I'll be brutal. I think it's remarkably bad. Okay. So our definitions should be subject to criteria of adequacy in that they need to make it clear how achieving a progressive sequence would realize realize more closely our goals. Then he says this: the account that follows will presuppose that there are goals for the project of inquiry that all people share. Well, that would be a bad presupposition, I think, or ought to share. And now we get onto the really extreme claim. The goals in question are impersonal, and then we need a specification of impersonal goals for science, goals that can ultimately be defended as worthy of universal endorsement. That's what we need, apparently. Okay, so Kuyper doesn't say why we need those goals. He doesn't say why we would need standards of that kind. I'm here assuming that the goals are going to fix the standards, right? But he doesn't say why we would need those. There's nothing there. He doesn't explain how they arise or how they're grounded, although predictably he later purports to tell us what they are. And he also suggests that we ought to share the underpinning goals. But what kind of normativity does it take to be involved in that claim, right? We ought to do it, right? Normative claim. Well, what kind of normativity is that? Where does that come from? That looks like something objective, right? I mean, if it's not, then what's the source? It just mean actually, what we need is the kind of goals that I value. No, he's not going to say that. I mean, although I suspect that might have been what was really going on, but he's not going to confess to that or say that in that context. It would look a bit silly if he said it. He'd just delete the sentence if he thought it was going to be read that way. Okay, so put this to one side. I get Kitcher for the moment. Why does it matter where the standards come from? Well, if we knew where they came from, it might help us to determine what they are. Might help us to determine which methods are appropriate to the task of isolating first-order progress makers, settling disputes about whether progress consists in furthering truth likeness or whether it consists in solving problems or all of the different options. It might also reveal the possibility of accounts that we haven't considered, or it might show we've been searching for one of these, a chimera. You know, you can search, you won't find. Actually, in searching for a chimera is probably better. At least you know you'll realize you found it if you do. It's just not clear that Ames talk is like that. Okay, so there are no careful discussions of the source of standards that I can find, but a presumption about what this is does occur in the literature. If you read it carefully, often this is not much time is spent on this, but it is said in passing in various points. And the source is supposed to be the aims of science, or the aim of science, which would of necessity be an aim of science, of course. So, for example, Loudon declares that progress is always progress relative to some set of aims. Interesting, Loudon has two books on progress, one in 77, one in 84, and he seems to use actually aims differently in each of the books, but without much comment. It's really interesting. It took me a long time to try to grapple with that and try to get a sense of what he was saying as a result. Similarly, Ninoto asserts that a philosophical analysis of scientific progress is tantamount to a specification of the aims of science. And Bird, more recently, Bird was perhaps responsible for reigniting the debate on first-order scientific progress makers. I was working with him for him at that time, and I wrote a response to his paper, so now I got sucked into this awful mess. He puts it like this: our conception of scientific progress is linked to what we take the aim of science to be. In general, something like the following principle holds: if the aim of X is Y, then X makes progress when X achieves Y, or promotes the achievement of Y. Okay. But I would point out in passing that if this progress aims link really obtains, then it does actually have some quite surprising consequences. For example, Delson has recently proposed what he calls a noetic view of progress, on which progress consists in increasing scientific understanding. From a certain point of view, I mean, if this link obtains, then this view shouldn't be very surprising or considered new. But I think it did surprise the people. They thought they had to respond to it, and it was a kind of new option. Because people have thought that achieving understanding is an aim of science for quite a long time, right? So I mean, I'm sure I can find stuff before this, but like Direct and Deeks in 10 years before, 11 years before, note that achieving understanding is generally acknowledged aim of science. So I mean, if the aims progress link obtains, then you think, well, you can get progress by increasing scientific understanding. But it doesn't seem that increasing understanding is really generally an acknowledged means by which science can progress. People argue about whether it is or whether it isn't. There are some relevant subtleties I could go into. I mean, some people could say that science can be subsumed under others. I know this is what Bird tries to do. He tries to say that increasing understanding can be subsumed under gaining knowledge, for example. Right? So there are moves you can make. Okay. So anyway, if the aims of science are second-order goodness makers, then what's the problem? What are you complaining about Rowbottom wasting our time? Well, the problem is this. Resnick put it so in 1993. The view that science has an aim or aims qualifies as a bona fide dogma in the philosophy of science. Even though this seems like a reasonable, or at least popular view, I like this, at least popular, it is not at all clear how we should understand this view. After all, science qua science cannot literally have aims. So the phrase aims of science must be taken as a metaphor. And then I quite like the advice of Orwell on this, actually having tried to decode the way different people use the metaphor. I spent a lot of time on this, worrying about this. I really think we might do better to jettison it, as I've argued elsewhere. So I got this little quote from Orwell: never use a metaphor or other figure of speech which you're used to seeing in print. Okay, his biases are writing about politics, but still, I think it perhaps goes for some areas of philosophy too. Maybe the situation, you know, you might think it had improved. I mean, you know, Rethink's writing back in '93. I mean, I don't think it really has. I mean, you can look at the exchange between Rosen and Van Frazen, and I don't think there's much else written on the aim of science as such, really. People use the notion, even in book titles and things. They don't tend to write very much about really what exactly they take them to be. So I had this paper in 2014 called Aim of Science, trying to show how philosophers talk past one another. Even sometimes they equivocate within the confines of their own work. And Newton Smith, for example, does this in one of his textbooks with their own Aim of Science talk. But at the same time as thinking this about the Aim of Science, I did keep arguing about scientific progress nonetheless. And maybe, you know, this was a mistake. Maybe I should have realized that, hold on, if I think science is aimless, perhaps I should think there's no such thing as progress too. I don't know. At least in my most recent book, I moved to talking more openly about what I valued and what an instrumentalist might value. You might think it's important that an instrumentalist can value something about science and tell you what they value about it, but you don't need progress to have that kind of thing. Okay, so Rethink's paper is really interesting. I think it's a really important but neglected paper. It hasn't been cited very much, I think. I can't remember exactly, but I think it's of the order of like 10 or 20, not much. And he identified 4 different potential accounts of what the aims of science may refer to. They could be shared goals or corporate goals or normative ideals or characteristics. And there are problems with each view. And I'm going to give you a quick, somewhat superficial overview of the problems. Shared goals. Well, identifying those seems like it would be a psychological or sociological problem, right? It's an empirical problem. So either philosophers of science have been remiss for decades in making empirical pronouncements without doing any spade work, or this just doesn't fit what they're talking about. I have been talking about. I mean, you can't reconstruct the debate they're having with this without thinking, wow, I mean, these people are just guessing about all kinds of empirical things, which would be really bad. Philosophers do lots of bad things, and I'm not sure if that was quite that bad. There is a recent exception, which is this paper by Ms. Vrije, but I mean, I have problems with the paper methodologically. It isn't clear that one can just search through text and find the way every time a word aim is being used. I mean, scientists are not always, it's always transparent what scientists are really trying to do from looking at their papers, for one thing, and from some higher empirical work. So yeah, there's some stuff out there trying to be empirical. If you think that's the view you want, okay. The other thing, of course, is that they can change, right? And they could have changed over the course of history. So why is all the literature saying, oh, the aim of science is knowledge, or the aim of science is understanding, or, I mean, do some history, find out. Okay. Why would you think there was a temporally invariant aim if this is the view you have? Doesn't seem to fit with what people have been doing. Now, a better option might be corporate goals. But the problem here is that science doesn't have a management or a hierarchical structure with a group at the top explicitly deciding on aims. Moreover, there weren't any baptismal goals for the enterprise. I suppose some people could argue maybe that, you know, if you really want to argue that science started with the creation of the Royal Society or something, if you're really you're some kind of, you know, enlightenment, you know, believer or something. But I mean, I believe that science has been done by the Greeks. So there are no baptismal goals like this. There are different people with different aims trying to do different things. There's no company charters. There's no place you can look to say it's a clear agreement on what the enterprise is seeking to do. Even imagine you're wrong. Imagine there is a management group. Then why haven't those philosophers who talk about aims identified it? If there was a baptismal goal, why haven't those philosophers who talk about aims argued for it with reference to the history of science? Why they haven't done that? So this is perhaps the worst. The worst of the characteristics is kind of just sort of irrelevant. Well, it isn't irrelevant. This is bad. I mean, I think it's pretty bad. This is where philosophers dream about how science would look in an ideal state, about the goals that scientists will ideally pursue. It seems totally disconnected from empirical reality. How would you resolve such a dispute? The realist, the rabid realist dreams of one thing, and the indignant instrumentalist dreams of another. Hard to take this as anything more than an expression of different, irreconcilable value judgments, which is indeed what I think it is. And perhaps some of the worst ever philosophy of science involving the most absurdly general and naive claims about how scientists should do their work has this kind of backbone. Popper's insistence on critical activity, continual testing and the underlying aim of falsification or perhaps corroboration. Generous, Kuhn's insistence on dogmatism over long and normal periods of science, that kind of stuff. Philosophers have a terrible tendency to overgeneralize. One of those things, and in a way, this whole kind of problem is part of that. Scientific progress is knowledge. I mean, it's kind of really, in a sense, the scientific method is bold hypothesis and testing. Really? I mean, have you looked at how science actually works? You really think it would be better if you worked out all the consequences, if you really implemented this and forced people to do it? It wasn't long before Popper started saying in response to Kuhn, I've always stressed the need for a little dogmatism, but he never said it at all before. This is kind of weird. Okay, so we can see also work of other social epistemologists who think that diversity is plausibly valuable. And I did a little bit in the past on how science might even profit in the presence of scientists with irrational aims or taking irrational approaches. You can have a variety of different functions. You don't need everyone doing one kind of thing. There's no one way to be a good scientist because you're a collective, right? I mean, this is what your project's about. Collectives can have different people forming different functions. Collectives can benefit from some people who are a bit bonkers and just going to push their theory, come what may, because it might just turn out that they actually are onto something. It might be super unlikely, but it's just that one person that, hey, you can let them run, you can get some benefit from it. And the final view is characteristics. Now, the characteristic view is just incomplete because there are many different characteristics of science and most have nothing to do with science's aims in any appreciable metaphorical sense, right? So science evolved mathematics. Science produces many documents containing the letter E. Presumably, these don't specify into science. So the advocate of the view is going to have to say the aims of science are a proper subset of the characteristics. Even if you narrow this down to cognitive characteristics, you'll still get the problem, right? You can say things like science involves people changing their opinions about the things that are in the world. Is that an aim of science? Maybe change their opinions? Well, not so obvious. So again, what I have to say is it's a proper subset, and then we're back at the beginning, right? So what picks out that proper subset of characteristics? Van Fraassen appeals to chess and war to advance this kind of view. But chess is a game where the criterion for success is stipulated as part of the design. Science doesn't like that. Wars, on the other hand, have concluded repeatedly. There are many examples of end states we can consider. They're also typically initiated by particular entities with well-defined hierarchies, governments with well-defined aims. Maybe they're not always all that well-defined, but you can ask someone who starts a war, what is it you seek to achieve? And normally they'll give you some kind of answer. They have a story about it. So really, I think Van Fraassen here looks to be discussing some kind of collective view, right? It isn't actually or hierarchical or corporate view. Okay, so those are the four options that Resnick presents, but things have changed a bit since Resnick was writing. And we now have some other options, and we have work on collective goals by Miller and Tuomela. So maybe we can look to this work on collective goals. There's not so much on collective goals as there is on collective intentionality. There's quite a lot of collective intentionality, not so much on collective goals specifically. But there's this one paper that's quite interesting. I don't think, unfortunately, there are such goals even in the weakest sense they require. So here's the weakest sense they require. I'm not going to go through it all. I'm just going to point out the bit that are underlined here. It's the idea that a member has the we goal P, if and only if she has the goal P. Well, okay, that makes sense. And believes that the others in the group, or most of them, have P as a goal. And that this is mutually believed in the group, right? So the problem is that most scientists must not only have the goal P, but must also believe that most other scientists share that goal, and that most other scientists believe that most other scientists share the goal. Okay. Now, I contend, it is only a contention, it's an empirical claim. Maybe I'm now doing my bad. I'm doing the bad philosopher thing. I'm just telling you empirically how I think it is. So yeah, please do try to shoot me down by doing some studies. I'd love to see the results. Many scientists would be reticent, I think, to ascribe general goals such as finding knowledge or finding as much of the truth as possible to most other scientists. At least that's my experience, and I have worked with, I've done quite a lot of empirical work with scientists, particularly with soft condensed matter physicists and molecular biologists, and they had a lot of differences of opinion about what constituted good science and what they were after. So I think their reticence would occur because of their awareness of the striking differences between disciplines and subdisciplines. as I say, empirical
I can't get the
hypothesis.
answer to that on Apple Watch.
The Apple Watch doesn't have an answer. Okay. So I think if a collective account of scientists' aims is to become tenable, then we need to do more work to show how collective commitment to a high level or overarching general goals comes about via engaging in shared practices, which do often involve collective low-level local goals. So, I mean, you could develop an account, maybe this can be done. I couldn't find a way to do it with the things like I could think of. So the way you might go is you might think, you can argue that participation in certain kinds of activities involved in science suggests a tacit acceptance of a specific purpose of the activity, right? Or it might be possible to consider how groups have a collective aims that arise as a result of their choices to affiliate to some extent and share some kind of ethos. So the best idea I could come up with, and suggested to me, it was suggested by Heather Douglas as a way someone might go. So I didn't come up with it. Heather Douglas pointed this out to me. And I started thinking about it, reading around it. So peer review is the example. But what I found is that historical studies of peer review, which tend to be, I mean, they're not written by philosophers, historians have not got an axe to grind on this. They don't support the idea that the process was introduced for any single reason. And actually, if anything, they emphasize that peer review has been used for quite different reasons over time. So here's Moxon and Fife saying the relative durability of refereeing to practice should not be mistaken for simple continuity of purpose or meaning, what it was meant to accomplish, whom it was intended to benefit, and the perception of its virtues and defects vary considerably with time and place. The nature and purpose of refereeing and of peer review vary importantly with context. That's their conclusion. And I found that paper pretty convincing, or a convincing piece of evidence for that view. Okay, so I said what I think are problems with trying to get this aimed at science idea to work. So although the existing accounts are problematic in several respects, I do think they highlight some important considerations for deciphering the metaphor if we can. And I do think, in particular, an adequate account is going to have to involve or relate to the aims of scientists in some way. And I think also it should be somehow involve some characteristics of science. So I think the characteristics claim is right. It just doesn't tell you exactly what aims are. So I think some kind of rationality requirement is needed as well. So the aims have to be rational. Why? Well, consider Loudon's insistence that the aim should not be utopian, for example, the aims of science. Consider also that no contemporary author on progress would argue that making progress involves increasing X, while accepting that the increases were impossible or a matter of luck, right? I mean, someone's going to say, I think that, progress involves increasing truth likeness of theories. And by the way, increasing truth likeness of theories is impossible. No one's going to say that. Or it's extremely improbable. In fact, better guessing by chance would be better. They're not going to say that. So I think that at least we can have a kind of necessary condition here on something being an aim. At least I can say that much. If we can get an account of aims, I think they should be hypothetically rational aims. By that I mean an aim it would be rational for a scientist to have in doing science, in virtue of what science can achieve, irrespective of when anyone's ever had it. So not merely any hypothetical aim will do. Having the aim of discovering God via science would be irrational, provided science can't provoke achievement of that goal, for example. So I consider different ways you could render this, and I end up with something like the following. X is a hypothetically rational cognitive aim in doing science, if and only if science raises the aleatory probability of achieving X, more than doing any other possible activity does, and X is a cognitive variety, of course. This might not be the final correct account, it'd be something in the vicinity. You can have something like that and basically agree this is a condition. So I want to allow it to be tweaked. It's only a short book. So you might add, for example, all science has a sufficiently high aleatory probability of achieving X, and X is a cognitive variety. I started actually considering just having a high aleatory probability, but there are some problems with that. One of the problems is that the probability required might vary by context, right? And it might depend on whether you could get close to that thing any other way. Sometimes it's rational for someone to do something, even though they think there's a very small chance of actually achieving the result. Yeah. Buy a lottery ticket, to try to win the lottery. I mean, it's not clear that's an irrational thing to do. Of course, a low probability you're going to win it. Okay, so what are the advantages of hypothetically rational aims? Well, one thing about them that's good, at least, is they're open for empirical investigation. insofar as what science can reliably achieve or more reliably achieve than other possible activities is an empirical matter. This entails that first order progress makers are also open for empirical investigation. At least some of them are. I mean, there might be problems with some of them, like approximate truth or truth, because they're not written, they're not an observable property, you might argue. And this is one of the problems some people have with some realist views. But some of them could be. So, you know, can it generate theories that have high simplicity, but nonetheless are pretty accurate in application, those kinds of things, reliably. So you could refute some claims about what first order progress makers are by showing that the probability of science resulting in those outcomes is sufficiently low. You couldn't show conclusively, I mean, you just had some evidence on the frequency. Maybe you could consider the centrality of two aims by measuring the probability differences involved. If you've got different probability intervals for the different things, then maybe that would show that it's more centrally has one aim rather than another. I don't know, it's possible. And maybe it's an open challenge, a solid account of the actual aims of science can be developed. And then according to what I argue here, it's just going to be necessary and sufficient for X to be a progress maker in science, for it to be a progress maker in science, that X is hypothetically rational aim of science and an actual aim of science as well. Right, so now I get to my position in closing. So I should start off with saying what I don't object to. I think there is an objective sense in which progress is possible once standards are simply accepted or imposed, or I prefer to put it as follows. There is an objective fact of the matter about the extent to which changes result in movement towards or away from a specified state in many cases. So Mackie put it like this, you know, given the sufficiently determinate standards, it will be an objective issue, a matter of truth and falsehood, how well any particular specimen measures up to those standards. Okay, so you can make comparative judgments. And I don't want to deny either that individual scientists and groups thereof have cognitive aims, which are often rational in the sense that I specified, and that progress can occur from their perspective due to specific changes in science. Of course, right? So I have no objection to the claim that gravitational wave physicists made significant progress in detecting a gravitational wave, provided that a gravitational wave was indeed detected and they were trying to do that. We know they were trying to do that. But finding that kind of wave is a relatively local, specific aim of a community and doing a whole host of specific things. Okay, like building the LEGO installations at Livingston and Hannaford. So those kind of aims, which are many and varied and quite local, they change regularly. They're all over the place. Think about what some of the philosophers are after here, right? They're after the aim of science as a whole. I mean, that maybe that was just an absurd thing to be looking for. So my position is inspired by Mackie, as I said. So I think I follow Mackie in thinking that we get the notion of something's being objectively good or having intrinsic value by reversing the direction of dependence, by making the desire depend upon the goodness instead of the goodness on the desire. When we desire something, we're apt to attribute goodness to it. Other people had this idea before, of course. I mean, Mackie actually Hobbes said it more. So here's my position laid out. Complicated, but I'll just run you through it very quickly. So claim one is that there are no objective standards or criteria that determine which changes in science are cognitively good or progressive. Claim two, I mean, they would be weird things, right? They'd be like moral facts. This is like Mackie's argument for queerness. Those would be odd things, right? Where are those standards? What, floating somewhere? They form? What are they? Where are they? Second claim that there are no epistemically privileged intersubjective standards or criteria that determine which changes in science are cognitively good or progressive. Of course, you can find different groups in science who are going to have different views about different groups of scientists, different groups of philosophers, but I don't think any of them are privileged. They're just different values of different groups of people, basically. Third, claims that perform scientific progress consists in X, i.e. statements concerning the identity of first-order progress makers, are false whenever they involve the presupposition or assumption that second-order progress makers are objective. So if you're assuming that you're using progress in that way, then it's like an error theory, right? All your claims are going to be false. Because you're resting those claims on the existence of things that don't exist, right? That your claim kind of implies there exists some X such that X is an objective standard, or X is an epistemically privileged intersubjective standard, and it doesn't. There's no such thing. Okay, so claims about scientific progress or regress having occurred are also false whenever they presuppose or assume that second-order progress makers are objective. And then I say the same thing about, I'll say something about how claims can be true. Well, claims of the form scientific progress consists in X can be true when they assume the operant cognitive standards to be imposed by individuals or groups, provided that X is the hypothetically rational aim to do science. X is valued by the pertinent individuals or groups. And claims about the occurrence of scientific progress or regress may also be true when they're indexed to an X, obeying the aforementioned conditions. And then there's claim 5, which is that philosophers of science would, for the most part, be better off not using progress. Talk of imposed standards or values can achieve the same ends in a more pellucid fashion. One thing I haven't mentioned, but probably should, is that another of Mackey's arguments is an argument from disagreement. I think that's kind of relevant here, potentially. Philosophers of science disagree terribly and continue to disagree for over 100 years on this issue, and it seems interminable. And perhaps one cause or explanation of the disagreement is simply that they're just expressing ultimately different value judgments. Right? There's no fact of the matter to serve as a breaker. And if there is a potential fact of the matter, then we never got to what it was because we never got clear on what the second order progress makers were. That's how I got into this. Okay, so in closing, let's imagine someone, I thought of someone in particular when I came up with this. Imagine someone at the bar afterwards, hopefully it won't come up in Q&A, and it just says, Rowbottom is either nuts or insincere. Of course, science makes progress independently of what we happen to value, and it's progressed a great deal, especially since the Enlightenment. All respectable first world intellectuals know this to be true. Science is one of our greatest success stories. We've got nuclear power, spacecraft, iPhones most importantly, right? I mean, forget those other things. Only relativists or charlatans, or worse, historians of science would say that it hasn't progressed. And here's my reply. So what makes science special is that it reliably, or more reliably than alternatives, results in all kinds of cognitive products that pseudo-scientific activities do not. And indeed, there are many hypothetically rational cognitive aims of people in doing science that they are not, say, in reading tarot. Or to put it differently, there are many possible desires in the cognitive realm that doing science can reliably help one to satisfy or to bring closer to satisfaction. And many such desires are held by individuals and groups inside and outside science. I didn't use progress, did I? I didn't use that naughty word. One need not use that word to say this. And adding, and that's what progress essentially is, seems to me like just thumping the table. It seems pretty empty, actually, in the same way that the ubiquitous contemporary talk of progressive politics and progressive policies is. If you look back over the history of what's been done in the name of progressive policies, or what's been suggested, compulsory sterilization, for example, and temperance, and these are not things I wish to be associated with. So I don't consider them progressive. I quite like a beer or a wine or a whiskey. And we'll be undoubtedly be having one this evening after this talk is over. It's later for me, so I get to have one early. So insisting that progress only concerns something narrower amounts to asserting that one kind of cognitive desire is more important than others, so I think. So I grant that talking science progressing performs a function. It does flag science as an epistemic authority. It encourages people to look to scientists to answer particular kinds of questions, like whether to be vaccinated against COVID. And Mackey thought in the moral realm that there are motives that supported objectification because it helps to regulate impersonal relations. It helps to kind of, give people a sense that there's more normative authority, like it's an objective thing, it's an objective rule, it's out there. And like my opponents, I suppose, I think this is a good effect, but I think the function can be formed just as well, and better, in fact, by just pointing out what science has done, what science can do, and what science probably will do. You don't need to talk about progress, I don't think. Look at all these things that scientists has done in the past. Look at what it's doing now, and here's a reasonable kind of assessment of what it can probably do in the future on that basis. Hey, it'll be inductive, but hey, what isn't? So, one last thing. I also see the contemporary realism debate in the philosophy of science as hinging on this kind of reliability issue rather than on worries about aims or success or progress. Maybe the simplest way to see this is as follows. Imagine someone showed that science reliably generated approximately true theories about unobservable things. If they showed that, wouldn't that be the greatest victory for realism? That would be great for realism. I guess I'd even be happy. I'd love to know those things, right? So I'd be like, wow, someone showed it at last. Brilliant. So do we need to add something about aims or success or progress? Do we need to posit intrinsic value in the products or argue they're valuable or should be valuable for everyone, like Kitchen? Couldn't we just simply note that science is worth doing for those that value such products? Also, I mean, would it be much of a problem for realism if it turned out the scientists themselves weren't scientific realists? Imagine their science reliably does this, they just don't know. I mean, is realism somehow, you know, in trouble? So the questions are somewhat rhetorical. I hope I earned one flourish like that. The only last thing I'd say is I do think some of the things I said here, it goes back to René's comments at the beginning, will go for other disciplines too, actually. I think it will go for philosophy. I don't think there's an aim of philosophy either. So I think you can carry across some of the arguments here, mutandis, to other areas. Thank you very much. Here are the references. I will just scroll through them slowly so you can, if someone wants to look back to the video, whatever, they can, you know, stop the talk at this point and find them. I think I missed out, actually, I missed out off here Loudon's Science and Values from 1984. I just realized that I was giving the talk. And here are some acknowledgements to people who helped me by reading it or giving me comments or gave me money for me to think about this. Thanks very much.
Just a very quick note for people who want to speak. Darrell might turn to the back because the camera is there, so he sees the back of everyone.
That's a good point. Yeah. So we have some 20 minutes for Q&A. And Darrell, thanks so much for this talk. I mean, if this wasn't iconoclastic, I don't know what is, but it's certainly stimulating. But thanks a lot. Questions, comments, and we can start with clarificatory things and then move to critical things later. So if anyone wants to clarify anything first, this would be the time to do it. Yeah.
This is definitely a clarificatory question because I'm really not sure if I got the point correctly. So, do you have any criterion to decide between aims of science and aims for science? Because your formulation of hypothetical rationality of X as an aim of science seem to apply quite well to aims, extra scientific aims for science, and then it becomes an extremely strong account. Like if science is instrumentally valuable in reaching an extra scientific goal, then it is rational to then that goal becomes rational.
Yeah, so good. So two things I'd say in response to that. First of all, bear in mind it has to be in the right kind of dimension. So it would have to be cognitive, first of all, for it to be a cognitive thing. Second is that the hypothetically rational thing is only a necessary condition for something to be an aim of science. It's not sufficient. So if you have a problem with things being for or outside, you don't think they should be included, that's fine, because I only offered a necessary condition. I hope that helps.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Right, thanks. What else? Clarifications or any sort of question, really?
Everyone just wants to criticize.
So, Darrell, maybe I can ask a question. There's one thing I was wondering about, and I can probably guess what your answer will be, but are you saying that there's no way to rank the different cognitive aims or goals that we might have, or that scientists might have, or scholars might have? It's just all up to individual tastes and preferences.
I think, look, I mean, I think you could have a ranking of how reliably your activity does that, an estimate of that, and there will probably be a fact of the matter. So you can do that. I am suspicious about whether doing that is then going to enable to translate across into some way of ultimately ranking which goal is superior or more important in some kind of, you know, in some kind of cognitive sense. So yeah, I guess I fear I'm saying, yeah, it's just it's your own personal taste. You know, you can go for whatever you're interested in, and I don't think we should be that scared of that. I mean, look, we're all people who are probably sat in this room or listening to me because we share actually some values, right? We are interested in finding out truths or approximate truths in particular kinds of domains, and I think that's great. But that's just me.
Right. So I mean, so to sort of make this concrete, what this seems to entail is that there's simply no way, at least no objective way, of saying that we ought to prefer like deep understanding of quantum physics over sort of isolated, grasping these isolated factoids about physics. There's nothing better about, objectively better about, a full grasp of quantum physics, deep grasp of understanding quantum physics,
Yeah.
isolated things.
That's right, but you can do things like argue that one of those things might be instrumentally valuable for doing something else that you value, right? Because I'd argue that actually one of the things we like to do as scientists is like to be able to manipulate models in our heads and to have some kind of clear understanding of the situation because it's useful for heuristic purposes and so on and so forth. So you can still have those kind of arguments, but then you're not going to say, you're not going to at the end say, and the ultimate intrinsic value is in serving these practical ends or something. You're just going to end up again with another value that's personal, I think, or group.
Right.
Does that help?
Yeah, it certainly clarifies things, so it helps in that sense.
Yeah, it doesn't help to convince you.
So looking at the audience here, any other questions, comments? Surely someone must disagree with all of this. Anna.
Yeah.
Don't know where to start disagreeing.
Yeah, from a less philosophical viewpoint, I thought it was a super interesting talk, and it made me think that since the seminar is about individual versus collective, I thought it came out a bit that maybe scientific progress or aims of science might actually work better as a concept on the individual level and less well at the collective level. Is that something you would agree with? I was thinking the whole time, to what extent is it a useful concept at all if it's so difficult to define, right? And then
so maybe you can ask the second half if you want to come back in a minute. So I do, of course, think we should talk about the aims of scientists, and that it can be useful to do that. It's not the same as the aim of science. I don't think they're different notions. And I do think that we can often identify interesting aims of individuals and interesting aims of research groups, and maybe even sometimes areas of disciplines and sub-disciplines. So I don't think there's any problem at that level. But the more general, when you get to really high level of generality, then I think you really get problems emerging. Because ultimately, aims are, because then it definitely is just metaphorical, right? In a really kind of extreme way. People didn't sign up or share or agree on having these particular aims or whatever they are. Yeah, go for it.
But do you think then that for the collective, for the whole, for all of science, is it useful to try and define this?
My answer, I suppose, is no. I think it's been a big. I think it's well, look, I'll explain why I think some people do it. So I've tried to be really charitable to one of my opponents. I think he was Bas van Fraazen. So I think what he's trying to do is give a philosopher's lens and say, look, I can interpret all of science in this sort of way, and it kind of makes sense interpreted like that. But if you really want to do that, then I think you can also do it without mentioning aims at all, actually. I mean, you could say that science just reliably does this, and I just don't see the push. I don't get the need for this aim talk. I just ultimately I don't get it, and no one's yet convinced me. And I can be convinced. I am reasonable. I'm not always a kind of iconoclastic that we really needed, or that forms are really important. That's an important philosophical job, actually. But of course, this has some problems then for progress talk, which is what I guess I didn't realize so much before, but what's dawned on me.
I'm all for purely conceptual analysis of such questions, but one of the core questions you had in your slides was where do these normative standards, second order goodness makers, come from? And they're totally lacking a historical perspective is, I guess, a little bit odd, because there actually are quite some obvious sources where they come from when we look at the history of science, because before we had this industrial scale science was organized in academies like the Italian Academy of Science, French Academy of Science, the Royal Society, and they were quite structured groups just in the way Gilbert, for example, or Tuomela describes them with charter and code. And those are actually our historical origins of pretty much all of our normative standards we still have today.
So I do agree, of course. So you can look at something like, the full name of the Royal Society originally was for the production of natural knowledge, right? That's true. You can find those kinds of things, and I don't deny that certain groups of people at certain times have had specific kind of aims. Of course, you have to be a bit careful when you look at what people say and the realities of what they are in fact actually aiming at. I mean, this is one of the problems with some of the most recent empirical work. You can get different people saying, yeah, I'm after knowledge, but it's not really clear that they're after the same thing, because it's not clear that their concepts of knowledge appropriately overlap, and it's not clear that you want to reify knowledge either. So yeah, if you think this is something that can be done, if you think you can go back and you can find those kinds of statements, and then you can look at the way that scientists can federate appropriately, then you might well find or be able to argue that this is an account of aims of science, or at least aims of science at that time and some of the subsequent time. Cool, that's great, but that's not what philosophers have been doing. It's like, no, I think it's understanding. I think it's knowledge. You don't find any of this kind of thing in the work that I'm aware of. And it would be, and in a way, would it be? Why would it be that philosophically interesting, right? So scientists were trying to do this. Okay.
Scientific expertise is also partly a service or profession in the service of society. So that would be philosophically interesting, to have this charter and code in the origination of scientific enterprise as the standard. So yeah,
I should be more careful. So why would it be? I guess why would it be interesting to a guy like me who's interested in kind of reasonably foundational issues or to do with inquiry? Of course, I'm not saying that it can't ever be interesting. That would be a big mistake. Lots of different things you can do in philosophy, more than I can conceive of, for sure.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Simulating break. I had actually one sort of a remark and one sort of question. The remark was more related to the attempt to having collective notions of progress. And it seems a very individualistic idea and approach to progress, that essentially scientists can do in terms of progress whatever they want, which, well, is fine from, let's say, a perspective of trying to deal with all the different types of perspectives that there are in terms of aims of science. But of course, science is also funded, and this is not funded by any individual in particular, but funding bodies, governments that do have particular aims and do have particular. So there is perhaps some collectivity, and whether you call that a particular aim or whether you call that progress, that might be more a type of semantic debate. But I'm just wondering what your perspective is on this collective notion of progress, or, well, other aims of science that might be relevant from this perspective of science funding.
Sure. So can I answer the first one first, just so I don't lose track? So I think, of course, politicians or other groups can seek, can want scientists to achieve particular things, and they will say that, you know, there's been progress when it achieves those things. They can say that that's fine relative to their own goals. But I think what they're primarily interested in most of all is what scientists can and can't reliably do. So if they think science can reliably do something, then they'll try to get science to do it. So I'm not, and we can just talk about what it is they want the scientists to do. Do we need progress? I guess what I'm saying, right? Their aims in asking scientists to do something for it to be done, or they want science to do something. They believe it can reliably do it, which is why they ask it of the scientists. They believe it's a hypothetically rational aim, so to speak, and that's it. I'm not sure we need the progress talk or to invoke progress to describe that phenomenon.
That sort of relates to the second question that I had. This idea of probably I have the terminology wrong, but the hypothetically rational aim for science, it involves very much what scientists do. but isn't what scientists do very much a question of what the aim is of science? So isn't it a sort of a circular definition that you they dissolve the problem of defining progress to just defining what scientists do, but what scientists do might very well involve the aim of what they want to achieve. There's essentially no distinction between, let's say, what a scientist, well, who calls themselves a scientist, let's say. And so
Sure,
what
sure.
the aim, well, other people that are trying to do something.
So I'm pretty sure it's not circular. I think that maybe it's not, maybe I wasn't entirely clear, or you're not entirely clear on what I meant, or I won't say it to you. Maybe we both committed some sins. So I think a hypothetically rational aim is just an aim that it would be rational for an individual to pursue, in the objective sense that science can really get you there, or get you there better than anywhere else. So imagine science can, or science is all the time, is generating approximately true theories about unobservable things. That doesn't mean anyone has that aim, but if they did have that aim, then it would be an objectively rational one, because science can really deliver the goods. That's all I meant. So what I mean is that for something, so what I'm saying is this, is that when I think that it is just, I should have maybe said this to Jerome as well. I don't think you should value something about science that science can't really do or do very well relative to anything else. So if I say I did mention this, but I value science because it will tell me, it will reveal to me the mysteries of God or something like that, then I think that's a mistake, because it doesn't relate to really science. It isn't sufficiently characteristic. So then that's a kind of misplaced value. Right? So I think our values should be properly placed. So that's a condition on what's an acceptable kind of thing to value, something like that. I hope that makes it a bit clearer.
Right. So I have 3 more questions on my list. So let's try and squeeze those in the final 5 to 7 minutes. The gentleman in the back.
Hi. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm James Evans from the University of Chicago. I was just, and I missed the very beginning, due to jet lag, my apologies. But I'm just curious, and I'm not sure, it wasn't obvious to me, but it seemed like you might be suggesting that, well, okay, so what if one assumes a kind of a, revealed preference, so that, people engage in activities, and those activities respect either institutional or individual or some convolution of those 2 sets of preferences, then at the very least, one has to suggest that there's like a distribution of aims to respond to activities. And one of the activities that, if it didn't exist, science wouldn't exist. I agree that it's necessary but not sufficient, is a sufficient sustained production and consumption of explanations, right? Insofar as that's what it is. I mean, there's many other things that one could do in the context of science, right? So, I mean, one could, produce data, one could produce descriptions, one could produce predictions, one could produce working and useful interventions. But it seems like if people don't engage in explanations and consume explanations, right? Effectively, the market for explanations, then it ceases to be what we've characterized as science. And so I don't know if that's a value or if that's just such an obvious baseline that you're assuming that it exists. In that sense, progress then becomes the progress of explanations, whether or not there's are progressive explanations with respect to any particular thing. So I'm just curious if maybe that just doesn't fall in line with values, because that's that's what gets produced, and that's what we consider the artifacts of science. But how does that fit in within this broader concept of a lack of a desire or willingness to order activities? I mean, if that's not there, then it ceases to be science, or what anyone recognizes as science.
Yes, so I mean, there are. I agree that you can say that an explanation is a cognitive good. I mean, of course, like all things you say, it seems obvious, but of course, philosophers of science they make what seems obvious very non-obvious. So I mean, there's so many arguments about what exactly an explanation would be and what it would look like and whether they're important. I tend to think you can have understanding without explanations, and understanding is quite a nice thing. If explanation is just answering a why question, then I guess you're going to have a lot of that going on. Could you have science without explanations? You could have science with making a lot of predictions. Imagine you couldn't retrodict, you could only predict. Would that be okay? I mean, I don't. I mean, maybe my intuitions don't pull always in the same directions as yours, I guess. But I think the overarching point you've got is that if you can identify some kind of so what you're suggesting is there might be some kind of, the overall point, forget explanation, is there might be some cognitive
That's exactly what I'm saying.
He doesn't know that the sound cut out.
Darrell, I don't know if you can hear us, but our sound can't cut out, so we can't hear you.
Us though?
Then more the mic on your end than for audio, but I'm not entirely sure.
And you can try on your end, maybe?
Okay, can you hear me okay now? Gone to a different source. Sorry, so the basic idea you were trying to suggest was that there might be a particular kind of activity that involves in cognitive change that you couldn't eliminate and that science still exists. I mean, it wouldn't be science if it didn't involve doing that kind of thing. Okay, I mean, that might be true. But then there are good explanations and bad explanations, I guess, on some views. Does it mean therefore we should value them? I guess, no, you pointed out a kind of, you've defined science, you've demarcated science somehow. And just because you've demarcated it, it doesn't, I mean, some people would say you wouldn't have science unless you made predictions, so all kinds of things. But no, I don't think that helps us with, it doesn't give us, because it's a kind of move from the is to the ought, right? So it doesn't help us, I don't think. This is the short answer. Sorry for rambling.
All right, so maybe we can put in one final question then.
Hi, great. Yes. So I thought it was interesting how you took us through this journey and you're talking about criticisms of other people's work, and I got really involved in it because I thought you were proponing it, and so I was really like thinking, oh, I don't agree with this, but actually you didn't agree with that. And I thought it was really interesting because you were not agreeing with these statements about the progress of science, and it came to a head eventually as you talked on. And I felt like for one thing, with scientific progress, a lot of it is historical. Like even the scientists, the funders wouldn't know whether the results would actually generate something, and the scientists themselves, in some cases, don't even know. And so that's why we try to pursue it, right? To see like whether we can actually generate electricity from the sun, for example. And I mean, from my perspective, I thought it was really interesting to see these different fields. As a psychologist, like who's interested in individual differences, I'm more inclined to view this question as an innate drive of individuals, of a minority of individuals that exists in every society, rather than as an overarching question, as an answerable question, as a what do you call it, rational aim. Yeah, and as you said, you do question this question. And I also appreciate how you would use different terms from your field. For example, you would say objective rational aim. And in science, we would often call it like whether it's a testable hypothesis, whether we can actually test the existence of God through science, or it's not a testable hypothesis, we can't generate any method to test that with our current tools. Yeah, and so it's more like a comment on how I felt. I don't know where he's looking actually. Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm looking at you, I can see you. Hi. Thank you for making me feel better for being an iconoclast.
Yeah, I just thought it was interesting how like you come from a different viewpoint depending on the method where you pursue your study.
Thank you.
So we're running out of time. So any closing thoughts in response, maybe?
Yeah, in response to the whole what everyone said. Well, I didn't get attacked as much as I thought I would, or my view didn't get attacked as much. It's a good job I'm giving it from a distance, though, and then you can switch me off and you can say, "Oh, what was all that about?" Crazy guy. Yeah, but I do think it is hard when you've been intellectually invested in a project to kind of step back from it. I think maybe what I was doing wasn't right or wasn't good enough. And even if someone were to think I was wrong in what I say, I do think a lot of work is needed to show why I'm wrong. Right? I mean, people really would need to work on something like the aim of science or what the second order progress maker was. So if you think I'm wrong, it is a challenge. And I think it's important, if that debate is going to carry on, that people start thinking about this kind of thing, about metanormative issues, as people have in epistemology and in ethics.
Right.
Thanks.
Darrell, thanks a bunch. This was an excellent way to kick off our seminar. So let's put hands together for Darrell.